All right, so we are recording. And then I'm going to go ahead and get started. It is 12:06. I think people have had time to grab their lunch and whatever they need to do. And if people join later, then that's okay, and I'm going to let them in. All right, Eve says, welcome all, thanks for attending. Like I said, Eve and Sarah are on our board, and they've been helping out a lot with our fundraising efforts this month. So thank you both. We appreciate you. All right, let's get started. Thank you all for being here on your Friday afternoon. I appreciate it. So I like to start every single one of my presentations with some group agreements, just because I think it's important to kind of set the tone for the space that we're going to be sharing together, especially because I think all of us are strangers. I usually do these presentations with organizations and groups of staff, and so everyone knows each other already. But I think it's really cool that we don't all know each other yet. So here are some group agreements that I like to use to, like I said, set the tone for the space. So the first one is to practice compassion and curiosity. We are here to learn, and I love questions. Please ask me questions. This is a small enough group where I am totally fine if you just want to unmute yourself and interrupt me. That's awesome. Please interrupt me with your questions or your thoughts. But do so compassionately, recognizing that we are going to be talking about some tough stuff today. So we want to be kind to each other. And that goes along with the next one, which is to remain respectful. And then the third one here is embrace accountability. So some of the things that we're going to be talking about are maybe going to be new ideas for some of us, which is totally fine. And we might not know the best language to ask questions, or we may have some ideas about some of the things that we're talking about that maybe are a little bit harmful. And that's okay. That's why we're here. We're here to learn. So if any of us, including myself, say something or type something in the chat that is harmful or could hurt somebody's feelings, I do just ask that we embrace that accountability and respect others and apologize or whatever we need to do to make that situation feel better. The next one here is to hold space for discomfort, which I think goes along with that. Like I said, we're going to be talking about some new concepts, hopefully. So I personally think that discomfort means that we are learning and growing, and discomfort is a good thing. So just holding that space, recognizing that some of this might be new. And then going along with that, practicing self-care. I don't want anybody to feel really uncomfortable or have any sort of mental health trigger or anything. Again, we are going to be talking about sexual assault and abuse, which, as we know, are really common issues and common experiences. So I'm willing to guess that some of us in this meeting, including myself, are survivors. So please make sure that you're taking care of yourself throughout this conversation. And then also confidentiality. So like I said, please ask questions, please talk about experiences, thoughts, anything that comes to mind. I'd love to hear it, but let's make sure that we're respecting confidentiality, not just for ourselves in this group, but also if you are talking about other experiences, or maybe you have a friend that had an experience, let's respect that confidentiality and privacy and not use names. And the person who just joined us, I do just want to let you know we are recording. So just to be aware, we are recording. And then the last bullet point here is one of my favorite quotes. This is by Mia Mingus, who is a fantastic transformative justice and disability justice activist. And she says, "We need each other to end violence." And I love that. I think it's a great start to all of these presentations, because I think it really makes it clear that this is a group effort. Like, I am not the sole owner of the knowledge in this presentation. I know that you all have experiences and lived experiences, and we all need each other and to learn from each other in order to end violence. So I think that's a great way to kind of start off this presentation. Are there any other kind of group agreements or expectations for this space that any of you would like to add? Okay, and if something comes up along the way, please let me know. I'm going to be looking at my chat, my private chat and my group chat. So if you ever want to say something in the chat that you don't want to say to the whole group, I can read that out anonymously also. So keep that in mind for participation. And I just wanted to, again, pause on the take care of yourself piece. We are going to be talking about racism, ableism, police violence, sexual assault, power and control, privilege, domestic violence a little bit, the criminal justice system, and restorative and transformative justice. So there's your little heads up. Please take care of yourself, do what you need to do to stay safe during this conversation. And then if you are experiencing abuse of any kind, I do want to let you know that our advocates are here for you. If you want to give them a call after this presentation, or if something comes up for you, please do. Our phone number is 303-839-5510. Okay, any thoughts or questions before we dive in? Okay. So today we are going to be covering power and control, intersectionality, how we talk about abuse, some different types of abuse, but I'm really going to focus on sexual assault just to keep it short in this hour, and also because that's the theme of this month. I did take out the case studies just for time, so we aren't going to do any case studies today, but then we are going to talk about kind of what can happen after abuse as well. All right, so I am curious to hear from you all. Again, if you want to unmute yourself, it's fine if you don't want to go on camera, or if you want to put in the chat, but I would love to kind of hear from the group. What is your perspective on power? Let's start there, but what is your perspective on power? What do you think that is? What might give one group or one person power in a situation? What are your thoughts? Can we maybe think of some examples of power? I really do want to hear from you if you're able to, or if you're in a space where you can share. Got some chats here, I'll read them out. Power is control. Someone has enough, or oh, the chat's moving. I lost it. Okay. Realizing one's ability to influence others. Power is control someone has over another person or organization. Someone who has influence, such as a manager. Yeah, that's a great example. Coercion. There are different kinds of power. Yeah, absolutely. Renee, could you say a little bit more about some different kinds of power? We've got authority over others. Yeah, go ahead.
I can't think really on the spot. I just know that from my past experience, there's, control, the kind of control that, say, authorities have over you, people who are in a position of authority, whether it's police or your boss. And then there's, emotional control, where it isn't necessarily, I don't know how to explain it, but where you, because it's emotional, you kind of allow another person to control, have power over your thoughts, your life, whatever.
Yeah, I love what you said about kind of the difference between that, like authority versus that emotional power. I really like that distinction. Thank you for bringing that up, because there are some people that have the potential to do things like fire you or arrest you. That is like a very tangible type of power, right? Versus what you're saying as more of this like internal, kind of, someone said in the chat too, coercion, this like very emotional type of power, or like interpersonal power. Yeah, that's a really great point. Thank you. Someone else says identity documents being withheld. Yeah, that's a really great example. So my next question for you all is, what do you think control is? So kind of what's the difference between power and control, if any? And I'm curious to hear what all your thoughts are. Renee says emotional power can feel stronger than other types of power. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Any thoughts about control? I'll give you all a second to keep typing in the chat. I love all of your thoughts so far. Okay, Mark says control is using power to potentially do harm. Yeah, Betty says control doesn't give others the option to make choices for themselves. Wow, these are really poignant. I love I love what you're saying. These are quotable thoughts. Actions that influence others, not just realizing they can. Yeah, I think all of you are kind of touching on the point that I wanted to make with this question, which is that power is not inherently bad. There are lots of examples where power is not necessarily bad, but it's when power gets kind of used against somebody in order to control them that we start running into issues and violence and harm. Yeah. Okay, what do you all think? What types of situations might there be both power and control? And I know this is a sexual assault webinar, but I think there are lots and lots and lots of different examples that aren't just interpersonal. So think big. What types of situations might there be power and control? Got lots in the chat here. Parenting. That's a really good example. Renee says legitimate power, information power, expert, reward, coercive, referent, charismatic, moral. That's a great list. Really powerful, powerful list. Yeah. Any other examples of power and control? Someone earlier mentioned police or employers, bosses. Anything else? Spouses and partners. Yeah, there's absolutely a potential for power and control in those intimate relationships. hmm Conditioned power. Yeah, from the internet, but when it comes to power over someone regarding use of sexual power in the workplace. So, yeah, so internet and sexual power in the workplace. Yeah, so harassment, maybe gender identity has something to do with it in workplace harassment. Oh, you got that list from the internet. Oh, okay. It's a good list. All right, I'm going to move on just so we have time to get through some of the rest of this. Okay, so when we're talking about power and control, I think it's really important to kind of understand power. And like you all pointed out, power has such a huge spectrum, right? So all the way from these intimate relationships to huge systems, like think about like the military has tons of power and control over lots of different situations. So there's tons and tons of examples of power and control. And when we're talking about power, I think it's super important to talk about privilege. So privilege refers to certain social advantages, benefits, or degrees of prestige and respect that an individual has by virtue of belonging to certain social identity groups. So if you look at this chart on the left side, this is kind of a visual representation of some different kind of like axes, I like to think of them, but different types of social power. So in the center here, we have the word power. So the people that kind of fall in this inner ring tend to have certain advantages in our society based on that identity. And then as we kind of move further out in that ring, that's where we start to get marginalization and people that don't experience those benefits by virtue of their identity. So something that I think is super important when we're talking about privilege is that recognizing that it is a privilege to not have to think about your privilege. So for example, If I am walking down the street, I don't have to think about my race because I'm white. And that's a privilege. It's something I don't ever have to think about really, especially not like for my safety. But somebody who's not white is probably going to have to be thinking about their race and thinking about their environment and their surroundings more than I am. And that's a privilege for me to not have to think about that, or to not have to think about that aspect of my identity all the time. But I'm curious again to hear from you all. What do you think of this chart? Are there any identities that really resonate with you? Are there anything that you think is missing from this chart? I know it's super detailed, so take a minute to look at it. Opinion. What do you mean by opinion? Different groups like military versus civilian. Yeah. Religion. hmm Yeah. Oh yeah, religion is not on here. It definitely should be. That's a really great point. Yeah. Um, a group that okay, visually identifiable religion, such as Orthodox Jews or Muslim. Religion, yes. Yeah, great. See, and that's my privilege showing that I didn't have to think about that. That didn't occur to me to put on this chart off the top of my head, right? Okay, formed or insufficient opinion. Yeah, so thinking about information and knowledge. Identity that I think should be included on this chart is body size. People who have larger bodies or who are fat tend to have less of those social advantages or social benefits than people who are thin. I agree. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So, kind of the big point that I'm trying to make with these last couple of slides is talking about systems of oppression. So, not necessarily thinking about specific individual identities, but thinking about these systems that kind of put us in those different spots on that chart. So, I'll give you a definition of oppression: a system that maintains advantage and disadvantage based on social group memberships and operates intentionally and unintentionally on individual, institutional, and cultural levels. So some examples of systems of oppression are things like racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, classism, ageism. There are tons and tons of them. There's one for every piece of that pie on that chart, and things that aren't on that chart as well. And you all have touched on this, but power and control exist everywhere in our society, not just in intimate relationships. So really the big point here is that systems of power, what they're actually doing is determining which bodies and minds has value, representation, and greater life chances. So if you have privilege within one of those systems of power, then you are automatically going to be valued or represented or have a different experience than somebody who is not represented in that privileged group. And I also always like to point out that movements, like social movements that are led by people that hold multiple of these identities and that address interlocking systems of oppression, are usually the most powerful. Um, and okay, so we've been talking about power and control, and I wanted to show you a power and control wheel. Is this new or is this familiar to folks? Probably, I'm guessing a mix. Some people may have seen it, some people maybe not. A couple people have seen it before, familiar. Okay, yeah, then really the power and control wheel is developed, use it at work, great. It was developed to describe intimate partner violence, so domestic violence between two people who are in a relationship or who have been in a relationship. But I think it is super applicable to lots and lots of situations, so everything that we've talked about before. So on the inside of the wheel, these spokes are different tactics of exerting that control, using that power in order to gain control, just like you all were saying. So things like intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, minimizing, denying, and blaming, using children, economic abuse, coercion, and threats. And to be honest with you, the power and control wheel is pretty old. So there's a couple of things that are outdated about it. For example, I think that it's unnecessarily gendered. So you're going to see she as the victim in all of these examples, which is not always true. And then this spoke here, male privilege. I personally, if I were to remake a power and control wheel, I would just take out the word male. I would just say that this spoke is the way that anybody can use any of those privileged identities or the power that they get in our society from that privileged identity against somebody else. So maybe that is your male privilege if you are a man in our patriarchal world. Maybe that is cisgender privilege if you are not a trans person in our transphobic world. Yeah, Renee says male privilege is a thing, even against other males. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. I definitely think male privilege is absolutely a part of power and control. All I was trying to get at was that I think there are lots of other types of privilege that also can be used in order to gain control or exert control over another person. Okay, so we've been kind of talking about this, but I want to name what we've been talking about. So when we're talking about all these different aspects of our identities, what we're talking about is this concept called intersectionality. So intersectionality, the definition of it is the complex, cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, like racism, sexism, and classism, combine, overlap, and intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized individuals or groups. And to way oversimplify this concept, it's that people are complicated. So I'm going to let Kimberly Crenshaw, who invented this term, talk about it herself. And I'm going to need to stop sharing real quick and then come back to it so that I can share sound. Sorry about that. Bear with me here. Okay, share sound, yes. Present. All right, so I'm gonna want a thumbs up from you all, and you can use your little reaction button, which is kind of fun. Thumbs up if you can hear this video. If it plays. There we go. Can you all hear that? Great.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit. It is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment.
So I'm going to pause it there just because this video I think was commissioned to talk about schools and education, but the concept is still super, super relevant to when we're talking about sexual assault or other types of violence. And I have another video for you all that's going to talk a little bit more about like the theory behind it.
What is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a way of understanding social relations by examining intersecting forms of discrimination. This means acknowledging that social systems are complicated and that many forms of oppression, like racism, sexism, and ageism, might be present and active at the same time in a person's life. Everyday approaches to building equality tend to focus on one type of discrimination, for instance sexism, and then work to address only that specific concern. But while the career of a young, white and able-bodied woman might improve with gender equality protections, an older, black, disabled lesbian may continue to be hampered by racism, ageism, ableism and homophobia in the workplace. Intersectionality is about understanding and addressing all potential roadblocks to an individual or group's well-being. But it's not as simple as just adding up oppressions and addressing each one individually. Racism, sexism, and ableism exist on their own, but when combined, they compound and transform the experience of oppression. Intersectionality acknowledges that unique oppressions exist, but is also dedicated to understanding how they change in combination. The roots of intersectionality lie within the Black feminist movement, with legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw originating the term. Crenshaw felt that anti-racist and feminist movements were both overlooking the unique challenges faced by Black women. She stated that legislation about race is framed to protect Black men, and legislation about sexism is understood to protect white women. So simply combining racism and sexism together does not therefore protect Black women. Intersectional theory is now applied across a range of social divisions and also to understandings of domination, such as those associated with whiteness, masculinity, and heterosexuality. Intersectionality is not only about multiple identities, and it's not a simple answer to solving problems around equality and diversity. It is, however, an essential framework as we truly engage with issues around privilege and power and work to bring them into the open. Intersectionality means listening to others, examining our own privileges, and asking questions about who may be excluded or adversely affected by our work. As importantly, it means taking measurable action to invite, include, and centre the voices and work of marginalised individuals.
Great. Any thoughts or questions about intersectionality? Is that new for folks, or was that already familiar for some people? Check the chat here. Familiar, yeah, great. Yeah, I'm guessing that we have kind of a mix of people who are a little bit familiar with this theory and people who have maybe never heard of it before. All right, so let's move on. So kind of applying this to what we're thinking about, which is violence or abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, those types of things. So I'm going to read some of these statistics, and I do just want to point out that these are really heavy statistics. So again, please take care of yourself. 1 in 3 Latinas have experienced abuse in their lifetime. 44% of lesbian women and 61% of bisexual women have experienced intimate partner violence. Over 40% of Black women experience domestic violence, and they are 2.5 times more likely to be murdered by men than white women are. Women who have experienced intimate partner violence are more than twice as likely to also report having a disability. 100% of LGBTQ+ prisoners have been sexually assaulted by staff, and 85% have been put in solitary confinement. 90% of homeless women have experienced severe physical or sexual abuse. The average life expectancy of trans women of color is 35 years old, and that's primarily due to interpersonal and institutional violence. 84% of Native American and Alaska Native women have experienced violence, and 90% of rapists of Native American women are not tribal members. Only 13% of victims of violent crime with disabilities end up receiving support from victim services. And somewhere between 40 and 80% of Asian Pacific Islander women have experienced abuse. So I think this set of statistics is a good way to kind of illustrate how some of these identities kind of increase, or not the identities, but the oppression that various identities experience increases your likelihood to experience violence. And I think you can also imagine like how these numbers start to stack up. Like Kimberly Crenshaw was saying, that they compound your likelihood to experience negative things in your life. So if you are LGBTQ and you're also Black and you are also disabled, you can imagine how your likelihood of experiencing violence is going to go way up. Okay, so let's talk about how we talk about abuse. Check the chat here. Substance use and misuse can contribute to percentages as well. Yeah, so that's a great point, thinking about how various systems of oppression really contribute to so many different things. So if you are part of a social group or social identity that has been historically oppressed, your likelihood for substance abuse tends to go up because of that systemic oppression that the group experiences. And that absolutely has impacts on violence and sexual assault and all of those types of things. Yeah, great point. Okay, so after we talked about those statistics, I think it's super important to talk about statistics. We always need to be super mindful about the way that statistics are used and where they come from, and know that correlation does not equal causation. So just because one particular group has higher rates of violence, that absolutely does not mean that that group is like inherently more violent or something like that. We always have to be thinking about all of these statistics and all of this information in the context of the systems of oppression and those intersecting systems of oppression that we've been talking about. So here's another quote from Kimberly, because she's wonderful. She said this back in 1994, but she says that it was feared that statistics reflecting the extent of domestic violence in minority communities might be selectively interpreted and publicized so as to undermine long-term efforts to force the police department to address domestic violence as a serious problem. Apparently, activists, so local activists from those groups, were worried that statistics might permit opponents to dismiss domestic violence as a minority problem and therefore not deserving of aggressive action. So the point here is that statistics are super powerful, but they always have to come with the context and that interpretation of them. So again, just because one particular group has higher rates of violence, we have to look at the context of systemic oppression for many, many, many years as absolutely contributing to that. All right, so I'm going to talk about some other ways that, or some other things that are super common in the way that violence is usually talked about. So there is a ton of binary thinking in a lot of the ways that we talk about sexual assault and domestic violence and all types of other abuse as well. So I pulled this list and this quote from an essay by this person who I don't know how to say their name. I'm going to try Nasrullah Mambrel. But they are talking about binary thinking in a very interesting way that was super, super interesting to me to read about. But they say that the binary logic of imperialism is a development of that tendency of Western thought in general to see the world in terms of binary oppositions that establish a relation of dominance. So when we're thinking about binary thinking and these kind of opposites, usually, and this list was fascinating to me when I first read it, but a lot of these binaries, these opposites that we talk about, tend to have a relationship of dominance or power that we've been talking about. So colonizer to colonized, white and Black, civilized or primitive, advanced versus slow, good and evil, beautiful, ugly, human, bestial, teacher, student, doctor, patient, abuser, abused, like all of these different opposites have that aspect of power in them. Super interesting. And this is all in the context. I want to give a quick definition of colonization. Colonization is the system of domination and exploitation. It's not usually a single event, but where one country invades and takes control of another country. So lots of places in our world have been colonized, including Turtle Island, which is where we live in North America. That's the indigenous name for this continent. So let's think about that as we kind of go through the next couple of slides. So one of the super common binary thought patterns that tends to come up when we talk about abuse is that men abuse women. And there are a couple of things really incorrect about this assumption or this way of thinking about it. So the idea that men are always or inherently abusive and that women are always or inherently weak or victims. And that's just not true. That is rooted in a lot of gender binary. And it's just not true. It's a really restrictive way of thinking about different genders. It's also rooted in heterosexism. So the idea that people are always going to be straight, so that men are always only going to be in relationships with women and vice versa, which is just not true. There are lots of people who don't even identify as a man or a woman, and there are lots of relationships that are not between a man and a woman. So that's just not an accurate way of thinking about violence. And this way of thinking really leads to a lot of harm for all genders. Like, this is not good for men either to have this role assigned to them, right? But it's a super, super common thing that we see in anti-violence spaces. So lots of examples of violence or sexual assault. If you are going to trainings or if you are a volunteer and you're learning, a lot of times the examples are always going to be of a straight, able-bodied white man abusing a straight, able-bodied white woman. And that's just not accurate to the majority of people's experiences. All right, so the next kind of binary thinking pattern that we have is that abusers are kind of the opposite of survivors. This slide and this concept was really personally difficult for me, just to be transparent with you all. This is something that I still struggle with as a survivor. It's really, really hard to conceptualize this as not a binary. But I think it's really important to kind of challenge that thinking within ourselves as a survivor. So part of the reason for this is that it's inaccurate, first of all. We know that people who have experienced abuse but somebody who is perpetrating abuse, sorry, I'm gonna start over the way I'm phrasing that, but somebody who has perpetrated abuse is really likely to have also experienced it. So not like a necessary like pathway or anything like that, but if you are perpetrating abuse, it is probably related to harm that you yourself have experienced at some point or another. So doing or engaging in this binary thinking is really harmful for survivors, because survivors can also be abusers. And if we are wanting to help survivors, we need to kind of break down this binary thought process about who is a survivor and who is an abuser. It also, I think, doesn't account for a lot of harm that gets caused within the criminal justice system. So we know that there are a lot of examples of harm and violence and sexual violence that occur within prisons. So incarcerated people have a lot of experiences with abuse within that prison system. So we know 31% of LGBTQ prisoners have been sexually assaulted by another prisoner, and 76% of them were intentionally placed at risk by staff. 79% of women in federal and state prisons reported physical abuse, and over 60% reported past sexual abuse. So if we're wanting to help survivors, we need to help survivors who are also incarcerated. They deserve it just as much as anyone else. And more than half of prisoners have actually experienced child abuse. And then I think on a practical side of things, once somebody is labeled as an abuser or has a criminal record, it's really difficult for them to access necessary services. So taking a look at policies within victim services programs and our are we allowing people who have been incarcerated to access our services as survivors? So it's this huge, huge, complicated issue and concept that's super tough to wrap your head around, but I think it's really important that we try. Okay, so some other kind of dichotomies, and Kimberly Crenshaw touches on this when she's talking about intersectionality. But part of the issue, which led to the need for an intersectional framework to kind of understand issues, was that there has been this very long-standing binary between racism activism and sexism activism. So there's a huge misconception that these issues are separate from each other, which they, of course, are not, as we learned from Kimberly. But there is such a long history of racism within the women's rights movement. And there's also a history of sexism within the civil rights movement. Both of those things are going to be impacting women of color who live at that intersection of those issues. So if the women's movement is racist, then Black women are going to have or women of color are going to have a really hard time engaging in that movement. And similarly, if the civil rights movement or anti-racism movement is sexist, then those same Black women or women of color are going to have a really hard time participating in that anti-racist work. And there is a huge history of this. It's a very, very big problem that luckily has been started to be addressed recently. And this is a quote. This is from Senator David Cohen in support of the Violence Against Women Act of 1991, which was just reaffirmed, which is awesome. But this is a super interesting quote because it has a lot of racism hidden in it, maybe not so hidden, but it's really interesting to see how racism is used to further the women's rights movement. So in order to pass the Violence Against Women's Act, this man was saying something really racist. So he said, rapes and domestic assaults are not limited to the streets of our inner cities or to those few highly publicized cases that we read about in the newspapers or see on the evening news. It is our mothers, wives, daughters, sisters, friends, neighbors, and coworkers who are being victimized. So basically what he's saying is that this is a problem that happens to white people, and that's why we should care, or people who live outside of cities or in suburbs, and that's why we should care. And that's pretty racist to say. Check the chat here. Yeah, Kristen says, it's as if women of color have had to choose which movement they're a part of. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's really horrific that that's what has happened. So here are some other examples of this issue. So social work has historically been a charity project that tends to be taken on by rich white women. So even today, sorry, we're adding some more people. Even today, 85% of social workers are women and 68% of them are white. So that's disproportionate, but it has its roots in the fact that we had social workers or like charity projects or some of the original, what would probably be called nonprofits, tended to be started by these rich upper class white women who wanted something to do. They wanted someone to save. So that's really the roots of a lot of the work that we do today. The women's suffrage movement has a really complicated relationship with racism. I could not explain it quickly, but basically there was a lot of betrayal that happened where there was a split in the women's suffrage movement because some of the women who were involved did not want to fight for racial liberation, and they thought that it was more important to have white women get the right to vote, purposefully leaving behind Black women. And so there was a big split in the movement. And you can Google that, there's lots of information out there. We also have examples of eugenics, so including forced sterilization of women of color, which continues to this day. You will hear stories about this happening in prison in particular, and also in immigration detention facilities as well, where people are being forcibly sterilized without their consent, or they're being coerced into that sterilization. as well as examples of Native American residential schools, which lasted all the way up until the 70s. And kind of all of these things that we're talking about really revolve around this idea of the white savior. It's sometimes called industrial complex, but it's basically this idea that white people, because of our privilege and because of the power that we hold, that we need to go save people who don't have that power or privilege. But there are lots of examples of this. So you may have heard the story about Renee Bach. She was a white woman who went and opened a school in Africa to treat children, and she had absolutely no medical experience, and she was acting as a doctor, and multiple children, I don't want to say the number because I don't know off the top of my head how many, but multiple children died under her care. And imagine if someone came into Denver and tried to open a hospital and treat people without any medical credentials. That would be absolutely unacceptable. Okay, somebody says Facebook said start time is 12. Yeah, so it's 12:51 here in Denver time, but I can absolutely send the PowerPoint out to everyone who registered. Yeah. Okay, so some other examples are things like international adoption that has this huge history of like financial things tied up in it, or even movies like The Help or The Blind Side, if you've seen those. They have those themes, right, of a white person coming in and saving somebody who's not white. And the focus of that story is on the white person. So those are some common examples. Incredible story. So this idea that people of color can't solve racism any more than women can't stop misogyny. So isn't it up to white people to fight racism? Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I think it is absolutely white people or our responsibility to do a ton of that work to fight and combat racism. Yeah. Okay, I want to get through because I know we only have a couple minutes left. Here are some various types of abuse. I'm only going to talk about sexual assault just for time today, but these are all different types of abuse that we work with at the initiative. So some key things to remember: all types of abuse can overlap. All types of abuse have a spectrum of severity, but with that said, there is no wrong way to feel about an experience that you had. Like, it's not a competition between like whose experience was worse or more traumatic. It's different for every single person. And the same type of experience can impact different people totally differently. And all of these forms of abuse can happen at any age except for child and elder abuse, which by definition have an age limit. But really, like, sexual assault is super common in domestic violence relationships, caregiver relationships. So all of these things can tend to be really intertwined with each other. So sexual assault is any sexual contact or behavior that occurs without consent. And consent, and I like this definition of consent in the bubble here because it's not specific to sex, but consent is the active and ongoing process of clarifying and respecting the boundaries of other people. So consent is not something that just happens in a sexual relationship or in a sexual encounter. It's something like maybe your boss asks you to stay late after work, and you can say yes or no. So that's consenting to something. And you can maybe you end up being really tired half an hour late and you need to go home. And that would be that ongoing process of clarifying and respecting boundaries and saying, hey, I am withdrawing my consent to stay late today because I need to go home. So it's not just sexual. But sexual assault can include all types of things. A really common misconception is that sexual assault has to include penetration, which is absolutely not true. And it definitely includes coercion, so somebody pressuring you to have sex when you don't want to. Someone says verbal sexual abuse. Yeah, suggestive language. Yeah. So you have brought me to my next slide here, which this triangle is the triangle of rape culture. So kind of at the bottom you see on the screen, it says normalization, kind of leads all the way up to degradation and assault at the top. But this normalization of some of these behaviors at the bottom directly like lays the foundation for some of these more like acute violent incidents to happen. So things like rape jokes or catcalling, like Mark said in the chat, like suggestive language or verbal sexual assault. Yeah, so some of these things are at the bottom and they're super normalized in our culture. And then we get all the way up to the top where we have rape, drugging, all of these things. But it's because we have a culture that sets us up for that. We have the foundation that's super normalized. I'm gonna not read those statistics just for time, but I'll send out the slides. So some things that can happen after abuse. Probably the most common one that we talk about is somebody can report. A report might happen because a survivor chooses to report. It might happen because a mandatory report is made if the person is a child or an at-risk adult or an elder. A neighbor might call the police if they hear something, or the police, the school, your church or your synagogue or religious place might make a report. But there are lots of reasons why someone might not want to report. Can we have some thoughts in the chat about why someone might not feel safe or not want to make a report about a sexual assault? What do you all think? Fear of retaliation, retaliation? Yeah, that is probably one of the biggest ones. Yeah. No one believing them. Yep, retaliation. Yeah. Just for time, I'm gonna go on and tell you some of my thoughts. Child protective services can often get involved, which can cause, yeah, reporting to certain institutions can cause further harm. Kristen, you knew exactly what I was gonna say. Yeah, so if you call the police, CPS might get involved, which might not actually be that useful. It also, having the police involved can make a dangerous situation even more dangerous, especially if the police end up not being able to do something in the moment. That retaliation can be really, really extreme. And yeah, calling the police is really not safe for a lot of people. We know that somewhere around half of police involved fatalities are disabled people. So there, and we, of course, there's lots of conversation happening right now about the Black community and the Latinx community around police involvement. So it can be really scary and legitimately dangerous for somebody to call the police. Yeah. So I'm just going to go over these really quick because I think it's important, but there are a couple of different kind of justice systems, if we want to call it that. So the first is what we're all probably the most familiar with. This is the carceral system or the retributive justice system. So this is really the theory that when an offender breaks the law, they need to experience punishment. And justice requires that they suffer in return and in response that is proportional to the crime, so going to jail. And then we also have an option, restorative justice, which is a process where all of the people involved and affected by an injustice have an opportunity to talk about how they've been affected by that act and decide what should be done to repair or restore that harm. And then we have transformative justice, which is a little bit different than restorative justice, but they're often kind of combined. Transformative justice is seeking to kind of think about why that harm happened in the first place. So not just how do we repair what happened, but how do we repair and also transform our environment so that it doesn't happen again. Let me check the chat. Yes, folks with disabilities of different types, especially where mental illness or IDD, which is intellectual developmental disability, is a factor, make up half of police killings. Yeah, it's really scary statistics. So I'm going to kind of skip these just because we don't have time, but I do want to mention just before we end here that it is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So thank you all for coming to this presentation. I really appreciated your participation and spending your afternoon with me. We are having a virtual auction on Monday, so you can find the information for that on our Facebook page. It's going to be live for a couple of weeks, and we're having kind of like a kickoff on Monday evening. And then we also, please, thank you so much for coming. And because this was part of our fundraising effort for this month, I would really appreciate if you could donate a couple of dollars to us. No pressure, of course. But if you're able, that would be very much appreciated. And we are super excited to announce that we got an anonymous donor who is quadruple matching all of our donations for this month. So if you give $25, that actually turns into $100. So right now is a really great time to give to us at the initiative. The chat, thank you. Yeah, of course, you are all welcome. The last thing that I want to do is just let you know who we are and what our services are. So here are some of our services. Please, if you've experienced abuse or if you know somebody that has, please refer them over to us. We specialize in working with people with disabilities, but it's absolutely not a requirement. You do not have to have disabilities to access our services. And the last thing I'm going to do, I put in the chat a link to a SurveyMonkey link, just to kind of give us some feedback on this presentation, what your thoughts are, and it lets our funders know that we're doing what we say we're doing. So if you could take 30 seconds to fill that out. And there is a question on there about case studies, which we didn't do in this presentation. So you can just put neutral, the middle answer for that one, or whatever you want, because we didn't do case studies there. And let me put our contact information up for you. There you have it. Any last questions? I have a couple minutes to stick around if people want to keep chatting or keep having a conversation. But thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate all of your time.
Thanks so much, Zoe.
Yeah, you're welcome, Eve. Thank you for listening in. Great. Well, it seems like people are heading off, so I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. Thank you again, everybody, for coming, and I will send out the slides to everybody who registered.
Bye, Zoe. Thanks so much.
Yeah, you're welcome, Sarah. Have a good weekend.
You too. Bye.
Okay, bye.